Hi, welcome to the Android app development in 2 hours. This was an introduction to Android app development. Over the many years I've been teaching mobile and Android app development in-person classes of often. With the students who wish they could have a taste of the classes before committing to a longer course. So here it is. And this year to 2 hours, I will show you some of the many aspects of developing Android applications. Of course, this is by no means a complete course. If you wish, take your train to the next level. I have a complete Android application development course as well. But for now, let's get ourselves a taste of what is coming our way. This course will ease you into learning how to develop Android applications. And I hope by the end of it you feel excited about continuing your learning to the next level. So let's get this started.
Hi to this first lesson. In this lesson, we got to get ourselves Android. The studio under the studio is an idea which stands for Integrated Development Environment. It's basically where you make other software the same way that you use Microsoft Word to make text document. We use ideas to make other software. So what we have to do is we have to head to develop that Android that come. And then over there you can actually go ahead and see Android Studio. And when you go to the Android Studio, it allows you to download version of the current Android, the Studio. At the time of this recording, the current version is 3.63. Usually you have a few different options when you go through download options, but they are oftentimes the beta version of that are not very stable. So you probably want to download the one that Android Studio is actually recommending at the time that you go there. For the most part of everything that we do in this course, that there is not going to be much difference between the different versions, and there's not going to be a difference whether you use a Macrovision or a Windows version. So just go ahead and download the Android is to do that you find in here instead on your device, on your computer. And then the next step is to move on to our next assignment, where we can actually load up on the studio and get a sense of how things actually work. So assuming that, listen. Or if you want, as an alternative, you can actually go to this little button up here, which has got like a little device with the shape of a half an Android on it. So you can go to either of those two. I'm going to be the manager. And what you want to do is you want to actually add in one device. I currently have two actual devices in here. I think one of them doesn't work and the other one does work. I'm actually going to go ahead and make one new one. So we actually get a sense of how do we create ones. So in here, if you don't have any Android visual devices, which you probably don't, but let's go ahead in here and press this little plus square and create new virtual device, and we have to do a few things in here. The first thing you want to do is you want to actually choose what kind of device you want to emulate. Time for the most for these devices. They either use a similar size, which is usually 10, 18 by 19, 20, or they use a size that is actually proportional to that. So for the most part, they can get away with using the same device for almost all of your tests. In my experience, I have found Pixel 2 to be one of the better, but they're testing visual devices. So if you want to just follow along with me, you can use that one. So you choose the device that you like to choose for a test. Let's say Pixel 2. I'm going to head next. And then the next thing you have to do is you actually have to decide which version of Android you want to try on that device. And this is where things are becoming a little bit more tricky and become more important. So in here, you have to actually choose the same API level that we decided earlier on, even though this isn't a necessity. But I feel like it's a good idea that we do everything on the same level of the API. This way we will minimize the level of confusion of the things that might happen. So I'm going to choose Oreo version 27. If you don't have it, you actually have to go ahead and say the download. If you press the download for any of these things is actually going to give you a little message, and it's going to take a little while before it can actually download that one. So, yeah, I'm actually going to go ahead and had to download it, and is going to tell me if I'm okay with the license agreement and everything. And I had accepted. Next I was going to take a little while before it can download the whole thing. Usually the API levels are something about the gigabyte. This one is like 875 megabytes. So once you're done with the download, you will end up seeing this here that the ones that they all downloaded, there is no more download button in front of them, and they actually have a slightly darker color. And once you are there, you can continue with this video. I'm not going to actually wait for the download simply because I don't want to keep you guys in here.
you can possibly doing here. Once you're done with the download, go ahead and hit next. And the last thing you have to do is you just have to give it a name. So I'm actually going to go ahead and call this one API 20. The reason I'm calling it, if I show you once again, is that because we are using one of the recommended system images, which is using Google Play services. And this is quite important later on in the course when you want to use the Google Play services such as connecting to Firebase or connecting to various APIs, we need to have one of the system images that they have Google Play enabled and all the recommended ones. They actually do that. So we don't really need to develop anything using the x86 or the older images. We kind of stick to the recommended ones. So here I'm actually going to go ahead and call it API27g.p, and I think that's about it. And then you have to finish and not take a little while and is going to create a new virtual device in here for you. Now, the moment you have the virtual device in here, it means you can actually use it to run our application. And to do that, here's what we're going to like, this little drop-down menu on the top, that is the one next to the Run button. And you're going to choose the correct one that you want to write. If you have a device connected to your machine, you might see that one. And if you have other visual devices, you might see them. The one I'm interested in is this one API 27. So I'm going to select that one and then I'm going to hit the Run and Compile a button that is next to it when I press that. A little while, let me actually hype this one, and it's going to boot up this one for us, which is an Android emulator, and this Android emulator, we are actually going to see our application depending on whether this is the first time we are loading it. Before it might take a little while. You have to be a little bit patient with it. Usually it shouldn't be more than about a minute. Again, it really depends on the type of device that you have and the type of computer and the processor you have, but you really shouldn't take a very long time. So now my application is actually loaded in here, and again, we don't really expect to see a lot because we haven't really done anything on our application. Our application is just showing us a text head award. But it shows us is working in the simulator. Everything is set up properly. There is a right connection between our Android Studio with our emulator. So that's what we were expecting to see. Everything is working, and now we are ready to move on to our next lesson. We'll come back in. This doesn't talk about the emulators, these are a piece of software that help us see our applications on our computers, hence the term emulators. I didn't into the studio. So what do you want to do? Is this you want to go ahead and say you start a new studio project, and once you start there, some of the things that I tell you these earliest stages is that I want to just kind of follow me without really wondering what they exactly do, because there are some of the areas that we need to come back to them later on. But for now, because I want to get some results quickly and we want to get build some confidence, I want to just follow me along. So here what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and say Phone and Tablet Empathy Project or EMT Activity Project. And in here you want to go ahead and put it in a certain folder, and you want to choose the language to be Kotlin. So these early settings for our application are quite important. But the good news is that the only way to do this just once, and then from that point on, for the most part, they're going to stay intact. Let me talk to you a little bit about what they are. The first thing I've been here is the name of your application. Let's say I want to call this one application my emulator application. It doesn't matter what you call it, but for now, I'm just going to give it the name that I know what it is. The second thing is the package name, and this package name is actually quite important simply because you want to offer the name that becomes quite unique. A very common practice in the industry is offering it the reverse of the name of your website. So you might use the name of my website is artinstitute.com. So the reverse of it becomes com, that are the institute. So if the name of your company is, for instance, example.com, what you do is you just go ahead and say com that example, and then automatically boundary list to your concatenated the name of your application at the end of it. The reason this is an important practice is simply because when so many different developers, they upload their applications to the on the replay market, they all want to have different names, and we want to have them as unique names, so no one other than me is going to have this particular domain. And because of that, this name is absolutely unique. And then my application, I'm going to make sure that I don't have another application with this name in my basically repository. So this is a way of making sure that your names are basically unique. Then you have the same location that you can actually find the space for it. In my case, I'm actually going to put it in here in my users. a mere desktop, this particular folder. You want to choose the language to be content because that's what we use in the older days, not the older. But just up until about 2 years ago, we used to do a lot of Java programming. These days we do a lot of content. And lastly, the very important thing in here is using a minimum SDK. This is something that we're going to talk about in more details in the future. What this basically means of what API of the various APIs around with. Are we targeting the higher that you go, you get more features, you get features that are very unique to Android version 10 or 11, so on and so forth. But obviously, the higher you go, you limit the number of the devices that you can target. For instance, with version 27, we can actually get about 53% of all the devices. This is a kind of an approximate, but you can kind of trust it if you go to say it, version 30, you would get less than 1% because not many devices are using this version. If you go to something much lower, let's say 24, because about 73% of the applications. So something that I said as a rule of thumb for the rest of this course is that for almost everything, we stick to version 27. And there are a few reasons for that. You will see when we get to them. There are a few libraries that we use that they only work with version 27. I feel like an andriod 27 is kind of giving us what we need in terms of the functionality and also giving us a good number of the more recent devices, 63.5%, even though you might feel that you are not getting 50% of all the devices. It also means that almost any device that has shown up in the past 3 or 4 years, you can get access to them, which is really a great thing for any application that you want to develop. So we had that. We say these are settings and we're going to say finished and we're going to build our project. And then the studio is basically going to open up with our new application. So the moment the of this video opens up, you can actually get rid of this tip of the day and then no maximizer in here. You really don't need to worry about any of the things that we're seeing here right now. We're going to talk about all of these details. We're going to learn what do they do? The one thing we want to learn right now is how can we actually show this application on actual device or an emulator. How can we see what this application does? Obviously, we can't expect this application to do a lot for us right now, but even if it's just an empty application, we should be able to see it somewhere, and that is where Android, which device basically comes into play. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to go to Tools Android Virtual Device Manager.
Welcome back. In this doesn't want to talk about the layout editor, this is basically where we build our user interfaces for applications using graphical interfaces. We can build a variety of UI, such as buttons, image, you use the scrolling views or similar. So I'm going to go ahead and to enter the studio and I'm actually going to go ahead and start a new application. So I'm going to go in here, say a stock in the application like before. I'm going to use empty activity. If you don't remember the settings, I'm going to really quickly recap them. We use SDK version 27. That's the one that we actually decided to use for the remainder of this course. We use the language of Corkman. This is the place that you actually save your application. We use the reverse name of our domain or website. Or if we don't have a website, we just use a reverse name of our name. Let's say, Steve, it doesn't matter for now. So we do that. Then the last thing we do is we actually have to give you the name. And this application I'm going to call it App for Layout Editor. Doesn't really matter what you call it at this point, because we are not really going to publish any of these applications or even send it to our friends or anything. We just do it for our own tests. So here's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to go ahead and say finish. And once again, once my understudy opens up in another lesson, which I think is the lesson coming up after this one, I'm going to talk to you about everything that is here in the Android Studio. But before that, I want to actually build a little bit of confidence. And because of that, we are going to one of the files in here. And I wanted you just follow me along. I want you to go here in your Android project. And if you don't really see this one here, you have to press a little project window. Or if you want, you can actually go to View 2 in Windows. And in here you can actually go to a project. So once you have in here, I want you to go to a folder called Resources Address. And I want you to go to for the record layout, I want to open a file called activity_main. Once you end up in the activity on this score, you might see this code or you might see an interface. Depending on the settings of Yolanda in the studio. But regardless, I want you to actually go up here and press this little button that can actually show The design of your Android Studio, which is basically going to show you what you are designing for this coming application. This is where we have that video that you saw it when we first ran our application. So in the design mode, I'm going to go in here. I'm going to say I don't want this one. Let's go ahead and delete it. And then from this palette of components on the side, I can actually add a few objects in here. Let's say I want to have a button on this one, then I want to make it a little bit larger. Alright. So like that. And then for my button, I want to take side to be, say, register. Let's say this is a registration view. And then in here, I'm actually going to go ahead the text. I'm going to say give me a plain text that is going to be there. I'm going to call this one username, for instance, and then I'm going to have another one, which is for a password. I'm going to place it there. Well, I want you to do it. I want you to just play around a little bit with all of this stuff. Some of the components you find in here, they make sense very easily, such as, when you want to add a button, or if you want to add a checkbox, or if you want to add, it takes some of them a little bit more complex stuff, such as when you want to add a layout, or if you want to add a container. You will get to see most of these through the course. The will probably won't get to see are rather simple. You can figure them out by yourself, or they give you some hints about how you should use them. But the important thing is that you have to learn that despite the activity on the score, main exam is basically where we create our Android application's interfaces. It has to almost run what is the design mode, which is the one we're currently using, and has a programming mode which you can actually hard code your pieces of interface, which we will see in the upcoming lessons. How we use that for now. I want to use that design mode and add a few elements in here so you can build a little bit of confidence into how the interfaces are actually created. Chip something in mind, that is, if you run this application right now, you will not see this interface. Let me actually show that to you. If I go ahead and run my application, and when the application loads, we actually see something like this, which is quite different. We only see one of the buttons and none of the two edit text. And that's simply because we need to set our constraints for this. And that's something that we can talk about in another lesson, in more details. If any of you are really interested in doing it right away and you want to get a sense of how it works, you basically need to set up where these different objects are laid out. I'm glad to a very basic one right now, simply because this is on the topic of this lesson. I'm going to go ahead and say there is a constant up there. There's another one over there. And then just this other object, say there's a constraint from this one to that one and one to the left of it. And then I'm going to say this button is in here, and that is that I know this makes up for a very ugly user interface, but this is actually going to work and they're going to be able to see it in our interface in here, which is giving us a little bit more confidence as to what things are and how they work. But again, like I said, we will have a lesson that we talk about these constraints in details and how we set them, as well as things such as guides and values and whatnot. For now, all you want to do is you want to go through these guys in here, all this stuff in the tablets, and just drag and drop some of them just to get a sense of what do they do and what do they mean. Again, some of them are going to be very simple. Some of them are going to be a little bit more complicated. Don't worry about the complex ones. You're not going to make any of these actually do anything. We are not writing any code. None of them is meant to work. They're just trying to get a little bit more familiarity with how this interface builder basically works for us. Once you're done with that, let's go ahead to our next lesson, where we actually explore all of our Android Studio and we get a sense of how things are actually working in here.
Is this guy? It is clear that he's showing us some value. Currently the value added it is called text view nas, right? Halo 1 is, for instance, now. But the text isn't just the value that you see on so many different things going on here. It has a weight. It has a height. It has an idea. It has a text. It has an alignment. It has a text size. And so many other things are going here. And that's an important part of dealing with programmatic objects. So in here, I want to go ahead and say from my text to you, what I'm interested in is the text value. Of it is so many different things that it is a weight and height, some of the easier ones to understand. This text alignment a little bit more complex. But for now, I'm only interested in the text value of the one that takes value of it to become this value crossline, for instance. Now, again, these are some of the things that you kind of have to follow me for now. Why do we put crossline between quotation marks is something but I come back to it in the future. But, you know, if you're familiar with any programming language, then you know, the reason otherwise is because it's a string and we see this more and more in the future. So if I go and I'll run this application now, once my simulator loads up, we will see that text has changed into Cotoning, and that's exactly what we expected to see. Now, this was one of the two ways that I suggested that we could do this. The other one was using defined view by idea. And I'm going to show you this simply because from time to time, this becomes very important. The other way of accessing something like it takes you is actually putting it into a variable. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to stay value and I'm going to call it my text view. You can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it my text bill. And then I'm going to say this. My picture is I actually find it the view wide-eyed and the type of the object is going to be a text view. And the idea for it is this idea. If you remember, it was called my text view. Right. So I'm going to go in here and say the name for it is that I've got my text. You know, the two names might be a little bit confusing in here because we call to both of them my text view. Let's say this text view was the result of a certain operation. So I'm going to call this text view right. It doesn't matter what you really call it. What is important is this part, which is basically getting access to a text view and placing it inside a new variable. What is a variable? What is a value? Don't worry about that. Those parts are going to come back to us in the future in a few lessons from now. For now, all that matters is this. Once you put your value through finding it by the inside, something that's going to be used similar to that way that we saw before. So I can say reside xview.text and I'm going to say this text becomes, say the name of my website. For instance, and I don't really need this guy anymore. So you really don't need to include that anymore. So two different ways of accessing values from our UI component, just like what we had in here. One of them is using the directly by getting the component's name. The other one is using them by the idea. Now I want to show you a little convention that they kind of use, the squared interactivity, main activity. I'm going to have this one, which is called my text the view, and then this. Go ahead. I have another text view. I'm going to put this one would actually make this a lot larger as well. Like the last time, I'm actually going to set some constraints in here so we can see them next to each other. I'm going to change the text size. Don't worry about these settings to do them perfectly like I'm doing. I'm just doing them so we can see them a little bit easier. And I think that's about it. So one of them is called my text view. That's the other one. And then this one, the one at the bottom. I'm actually going to call it the bottom text view. And I do this convention for myself and you can actually, you know, get used to that. I find it very useful. I'm actually going to add a suffix of ieta at the end of it. There is an I do, that is that these are the kind of objects I want to get them by the command, the find, the view by idea. And these are the ones I want to get them directly. If I'm going to go get them directly, I use this combination. If I'm going to get them by the idea, for whatever reason I use this other convention. Other people have seen that they use conventions such as this one or them, takes the view, for instance. And so they basically put everything as local law cases. And they also underscores between them. This could be a good convention as well. It just gives you an indication which one of them you can access by. Yet, which one of them you are going to access by directly. So let's see the two of them. So this one is the one we already did and we accessed it directly. The other one, they say the result takes view, is the one we're actually going to go ahead by the then takes you idea, and then we make some changes to that. Now, you might be wondering, so which one of these two methods I should be using? Should I be using them directly like this, or should I be using the find the new idea? The rule of thumb is as much as you can. You have to get them directly if there is a situation that you cannot. And then we use this method and we will see the situations where you cannot use the direct method and we end up with this. I just want you to be familiar with both of these systems for the most part, for probably more than 75% of the situations we use this method, whatever name we gave it in here, we just go ahead and say that object and then we do whatever we want to do with it. But from time to time, we might need this one. So I want you to know the find the view by the method as well. So play around with this a little bit. Make sure that, you are the few different objects into your activity. You access them in here quickly, and once you're good and ready with that, let's move on to our next lesson. Hi, welcome back. In this system, we begin writing in code and we learn how to access various UI components from within those codes. So let's go ahead and get us started in the studio. And yet, I'm going to start a new project and I'm going to call this new project just as always. All the settings, things are going to stay the same. The only thing in here, I'm going to call this one accessing UI components. Alright. So that's going to be the name of our application. Again, it doesn't matter what name you give it on. Once we're done, I'm going to finish, wait for it to load up another. My application has been created. I have the same things as before. I have the main activity file, which is where we're going to begin to work on. And I also have this resource as layout in here. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to go to resources, layout activity, _ main. XML, and this one I'm going to go ahead and make myself a little text. So we have a text in here, which is written. Hello. What? I don't really want that. Also, I want to show you that you have these two different views in here, and one of them is actually a blueprint of the actual view. So if you don't want to see that, you can actually go up here and say, just show me the design. So that we only see the design again. If you're in the code mode, you can press this little button to go to a design mode. And yet if you don't want to see the blueprint, you can actually go ahead and say, just show me the design. So that's what we need to work on right now. Let's go ahead in here and say in here, I'm actually going to go ahead and have a text view. I'm going to make this text view much larger, maybe something like that. Alright. And then let's go ahead and make some extra changes in here as well, for instance. And these are the things that one step at a time, you have to learn them on the fly as the course is going along. So I'm going to go up in here and search for text size, for instance. I'm going to say the text size I want to use is actually 24 sp, what a speed is. Don't worry about it. It come to it in the future. We'll have a lesson that we talk about these different formats in here. Then I'm actually going to go ahead and say give me the text alignment, put it right in the center. So that's going to be the way that my text is shown. Maybe I make it a little bit longer. Let's say the text size, I make it 32 speed. And the last thing I want to do is I want to know what is the idea of it in here. The idea of it currently is text the view. Let's go ahead and call it my text view. It doesn't matter what it is called, it matters that you know what it is called for. Now, I call it my text view, and that's all I have done in my layout editor for now. So the next thing is I'm going to head back to my main activity. And here in the code, we actually wanted to do something with that. Now, there's quite a bit of code in here already, and some of it may not make any sense to you right away. This is going to be one of those areas. They just kind of want you to follow along with me, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense. The one thing you want to know is that in your main activity file, that is a function here called uncreate. This function happens the moment the application loads. So basically an activity is a view. So the applique activity is the one that we see when the application loads, and you can have different activities. Imagine if this is, let's say, a social media application, you might have an activity as the home activity, and then you might have an activity that's called the profile activity that shows the profile of a particular user in our application. We only have one activity that's called our main activity. Now, in the main activity, there is a function that is called uncreate. We will come back to these topics in the future. But for now, just so we get some familiarity, the uncreate is the function that runs the moment the application loads up. So whatever we're doing here is going to happen right at the moment the application is shown to the user in here. What they want to do is this. I want to go to the end of this function. I want to get myself a little bit more space in here. Still retain the curly brackets of the function. I want to do this. I want to go ahead and write my text view, and I'm going to necessarily let it autocomplete. So I'm not going to actually write everything on my own, because if you do that, it's going to actually become red and gives you an error. I want to do this. I want to write parts of it and then let it auto-complete. And once this drop-down window opens up, I'm actually going to enter. I want you to pay attention to what happens when I hit enter up here in the import. Then I do that. It automatically imports this file. It says, well, apparently there is stuff that you want to get from activity _main, so I'm going to get them for you. Let's see that once again. If I don't have that, if I go ahead and say my takes the view, then it becomes a red and tells me this is an unresolved reference. It says, I don't know what this takes. The view is so unnecessarily for everything like that, you want to make sure that you let it auto-complete. And automatically adds everything that is going to need. Now, it isn't to say that if you made a mistake like this, there's no way around it. Yes. The absolute thing is if you want, you can actually go ahead in here and manually enter them. And under the study is a smart enough that's telling you how you should do that. In this case, it says you have to press the option and enter buttons. So if you had option and enter, it automatically adds to the stuff that it needs in here. But it's a better practice that we do it on the fly. So I'm going to go in here and say, text view, on the moment the drop-down menu opens up, I'm going to hit it. I'm going to get what I want. Now, what do you want from my text? You might text you. Welcome back. In previous lessons, we learned how we could get access to various components here. We want to learn how we can execute this specific task when we access a particular component. So let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and do that in Andriod in the studio. I'm going to start a new studio project just like always. I'm going to call this one buttons up and I'm going to keep all the settings as it used to be before. Version 27 caught in the reverse of my domain and I'm going to save it somewhere. Finish and was under the studio opens up. I'm going to head to my resources layout and in here you can actually press the layout activity and go there. Or I could actually show you a little shortcut as well. And the shortcut is you can actually go to your main activity, which is the file that usually opens up when you go to your under the studio. You can hold the control button or the command button if you're using a Mac machine like I'm doing, and then click on the name activity main and it's going to take you directly to your activity main if you want to. So two ways of doing it. Either you tap on the activity on this colon or you go to your main activity and you tap on that. Right. So here I'm going to go ahead and say I want to have a few new layouts. One of them is going to be it takes you just like always we put the text view up there so we can see what's happening. I'm going to go ahead and change the text size and I'm going to make it a lot larger, 32 USPI. I'm going to go ahead and align it to the center so it becomes a little bit easier to see. And then I'm going to add a button and this one then I'm going to put it in here somewhere like that. And then my brother actually says, have to talk to like in the for instance, or just like you said. It's not going to really do anything right now, but it's going to show us that so we get a sense of what it would be, the purpose of it. Now, you probably need to set up some of your constraints, at least. So I'm going to set that one and I'm going to set this one. So at least for these two. And then the next thing you do is you want to learn two different methods in which we can actually access a button. One of them is using something called onClick. The other one is using something called setOnClickListener. So I'm going to show you both of these because depending on the situation, they both become quite important and quite useful. So the first one is that I'm going to go ahead and say the name of my text is actually my text view. Just like the last time on the name of my button is going to be my button. So here, my button. Alright. So we have these two taken care of. Then I'm going to head back to my main activity .cotonying and file all the main programming files that we have in here. I'm going to tap on that. And in here again, inside the body of my uncreate, I want to write some code. What do I want to write? I want to say my then and just like the last time I'm going to autocomplete and once I have my button auto-completed, I'm going to go ahead and say, sit on click listener, and I'm going to use the second method in here, and we will see in the future what are these different, what we call overlords or flavors. Basically, I'm going to use the second overload, which is essentially set on this and then an open markets, and then here we can do whatever we want to be doing in here. Don't worry about how the code is structured. Again, these are things that we'll get back to them in the future. For now, it is important that we just learn how we use them for the time being. Now, before I write something in the body of his, let's remember something we did in the previous lesson. In the previous system, we said my text view that text became tello, for instance. Now, all I want to do is this. I want to say this part actually happens inside here. So whenever my button is click on, you do this, you run this function, whatever is inside here, only when the button has been tapped on. And let's see how that's going to work for us. So now I have these two. I have a button that says, like in, and I have a text, and if I type on the line, it actually becomes hetal, simply because our code in here, it says unclick listener changed that. Remember, all of that is inside the body of the uncreate. Now, I want to show you another way, which is doing pretty much the same thing. But that thing is not going to be inside the uncreate. And this is a different method of doing things with the buttons. So the other method is this. Let's go ahead and add a new button in here. I'm going to go ahead and add a third object on the second button. I'm going to put this one in here. I'm going to call this one, let's call it, let's say it says you. By then, and then for the I'm going to set the constraint and therefore the idea of it. I'm going to call it new button, and that's it, new button. And here I'm going to go ahead to my main activity and add a new function. Let's see how we add these type of functions. I'm going to come outside the uncreate sonatine side there. I'm actually going to come outside. But obviously it's still within our main activity class. I'm going to say fun, and in the function I'm going to say new button function. And then within the synthesis, I'm going to say in the column, and it's after type view, and I have to let it autocomplete because it needs to import some stuff. If I just type it like this, is going to give me an error saying I don't know what that is. So again, I'm going to complete his enter, and then I'm going to say this is the body of it. So what does this mean? Just think hard here. We had the function uncreate and it had some arguments inside it. Now I have a function of my own called the new Python function, and it has an argument of the type of view it must have with that. And then within the body of it, we can do whatever we want to do. For instance, my text, that view that the text becomes this is. Alright. So now we have created a new function, just like the uncreate function. But the uncreate function, it happens automatically when the application loads vendors this function. Run. And if you're not familiar with what is a function and what is a class, don't worry at all. We going to get 2 lessons that we talk about object-oriented programming and classes and functions. And methods, and all of these things are going to be super clear by then. For now, we just want to learn how we use it, some of this basic stuff, so we can actually build a little foundation for our future lessons. So here I'm going to say I have this function. I don't know how am I going to call it. Here is how I'm going to copy its name. I'm going to go to my activity main. I'm going to select the button that I want to call, and I'm going to search for something called unclick. And then I'm going to say, until they do that, I automatically shows me that's the only one that is actually available. So I'm going to say on new button function is the function we're going to get called every time this guy has been clicked on. And if you go ahead and we run this application now, let's see what we get the next time that it actually loads up here. I have the 2 buttons. One of them turns that into a hello. The other one turns it into a this is a cartooning. And that's exactly what we expect to see. So basically 2 different ways of connecting our buttons to our functions. One of them is using a set on calculus, and the other one is using a unclick function, using a function that has an argument of the type view. This is a key part of it. It must be there. What is a view? We will see in a few lessons and we get a better sense of it just so that you get an overall understanding of it. The view is the very basic object that you can see in your activity in here. So any of these guys, it is basically a child of the view. This is a child of the view, which also allows for a text. This is a child of the view that allows for the text and also allows for interactivity, so on and so forth. But they will come to this in the future. For now, what matters is basically these 3 lines of code and these 4 lines of code. So we learned 2 different ways of interacting with our buttons. Once you're good with that, let's move on to our next lesson. Hi, welcome back. This is the guy talking about image views. These assets, they help us show images are basically digital photographs or icons in different parts of our applications. So let's get this started. I'm going to have to Andrew in the studio and start a new application activity. I'm going to call it Images app. And then the moment that our application loads up, I want to actually add some images to it. So I have some images in here. I've actually added 2 images that are basically images of Vancouver where I live. Something you want to keep in mind is that in this method, which is basically adding images statically to our Android, to the applications, you want to avoid using images that are very, very large. So try not to go above anything that is like 1500 pixels because otherwise we have to apply some image factor into it that resize us the images. So that's something that we can see in the future lessons. But for now, let's go with images that are kind of smaller about, 1500 pixels, a regular sized image. Would you just avoid very large images? So what you want to do is you actually want to add these images to your application. So in here, I'm going to go to our resources folder as a folder in the folder. I'm going to go to Draw Well, and I'm going to drag these 2 images to my drawable. And then here I'm going to say, yes, do everything that you're supposed to be doing. And as those 2 images to my Android Studio, now we have to see how we're going to use these images. One of them is called the one building. The other one is called Vancouver image. Something to keep in mind is this. There must be lowercase letters. You absolutely cannot add images that they don't have a lowercase or they have uppercase letters in them. Basically, anything that you add in the rest folder, there must be law cases. That's why you have C on this call launcher, _background. All of them are lowercase letters in the values. You have the same thing in the box on the layouts. So that's something you absolutely want to keep in mind. So let's go ahead into my layout, and in my layout, I'm going to go ahead, get rid of that. I'm actually going to go ahead and add an image of you. And the moment you add an image, it says of each of the images you want to add, I'm going to say, I want to give it the van building. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that. And in here, that image, let's go ahead and resize this guy a little bit more, resize it and place it in here. Now, there are a few things we could change about it. Primarily, the thing that I want to actually change about it is something called scale type, which is a very important, a very useful thing to change. So scale type is basically how does your image actually show inside your image of you? How does it resize itself to show it to you? I'm going to go ahead and say give me something called a fit center, which is the default mode, which is going to try to fit your object or your image without making any changes to its proportions. How about we try something called if I'm not drawing, I'm going to try center inside, which actually does a similar thing, the one that I actually wanted these fits and not, so that was the one I tried. Center. So what it does is basically it resize your image in a way that it fits the entirety of your image of view without changing the proportions of your image. You could, for instance, go ahead and say, give me a fit XY, which is going to try to squeeze your image inside your image view. But that's just usually not what we want, because you want to make sure the image doesn't get stretched out or squeezed out. What we want to do is we want to make sure that we keep the proportions of it. Again, this really depends on what you are trying to do. I kind of like center for this example. So in this one, if my image was very wide, it would become like this. If it was very tall, it would become like that. And that's something, you know, it's going to work for this purpose, not whether I want to do. Next year. I'm actually going to go ahead and say, let's fit this object horizontally and vertically. So it is there, and then the last thing is we remember what is it called, is called an image of you. This is my image of you. So that's the name of my image of, you know, this is all good and bad, but only works when you are in the layout editor. What if you want to change the image using the code in here? So to do that, I'm actually going to go ahead to my main activity. And in here in the uncreate, I'm going to go ahead and say my image of you got set on click listener. So whenever I click on my image of you, what do I want to happen when I actually change the image in my image of you? So I'm going to say my image of you that said image resource. Now, the image that they already did use is called the brand building. So I want to use the other one. So I want to say, get me the resources.tribal.vancouver image. So, my image of you said image resource and then the name of the image that I want to use, and that's as simple as it gets. Just go ahead and run this application and let's see it in my emulator. And here I have that image, and when I click on it, it changes to the other image, which is exactly what I expected to see. So quick recap of everything that we did in here. We had an image of you, the other images into the drawable folder. And we said to one of them using the layout editor and the other one, we used it programmatically using set unclick listener. Whenever we click on that image, it changes itself to show the other image. And that's all we have to do here. And let's see, let's move on to our next lesson. Hey, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but even though this is a shorter course, I thought it might be worth it for us to take a quick break together. In this break, I want to show you a very handy and useful utility tool. This is a way to speed up videos. I don't mean the built-in feature of many of different websites. I mean using it. It's an extension that helps us to speed up videos to any speed that we want. So here I'm going to go to Google and search for video, a speed controller. There are many different videos with controllers. The one I'm using in particular is actually called the Video Speed Controller, as written by Joggle Rick. Or something to that effect. The advantage of this particular extension is that, for instance, if I go to a video on YouTube, I can see on the top left that she tells me the current speed is being played. And if I want to change that, I can use the hots of the mouse. So as I'm holding the deeper than on my keyboard, this speed keeps going up, so I can basically keep pushing it up to whatever speed that they want. And then at any point they wanted to drop it back, I press this button again to drop this speed to a normal speed. This is a very handy tool. They use it all the time when I'm watching videos, or even when I'm watching this, you know, instruction, or any other kind of topic on YouTube. So I would really recommend that you get yourself something like this. And once you're good, this continue. If I go to this one, to this function says it would return a string. It's meant that whenever it is done, it has to return a string to us. That's not what we want to be doing. That would be the case in here. I want to say, when you do the multiplication, you return an integer value to us. What is the value? Most likely it is the value of the result. So here, I'm going to go ahead and say return what? The return result. So it basically says whenever you call this function is going to do some stuff in here. And at the end it must return an integer because this value is of the type integer return. If you don't have this by default, it's basically like this, which says you don't return anything. So having a void or not having it at all is exactly identical. It simply means nothing gets a return. But in this case, I don't want that. I actually want to return an integer. And now let's see how going to use it in my uncreate. I want you to think for a second as to what does this line of code actually mean. If you want, do for a second. Think about, and then I'll explain what does it mean. So basically in here, if you put this function multiply or function 6 by 8, it means it will do this calculation, which is multiplying them together, and we return. So in this case, 6 by 8, it would be 48. So this line of code is basically equivalent to putting this value right in the middle of your column. is like writing 48 somewhere in the middle of your code, which isn't very meaningful. So you basically want to do things that you can actually wait for the results to come and do some calculation on that. For instance, I want to go ahead and say I have a value, let's call it m or let's call it output. For instance, I want to be a of different names so they actually don't become confusing. I'm going to say the output is actually the value that this guy creates. So basically right now in this application, output is going to be 48. What do you do with that? It's something that we will see in the future. Or you can think of many ways of doing it. For instance, you can actually do this multiplication divisions and we see a far more complex matters in the future. So those are the basics of having functions that they don't take any arguments or they do take an argument and they do something. That functions, that they take multiple arguments and they take multiple arguments and they return something, or they could be functions that they don't take any arguments. They just returned values such as those that we use when we communicate with feedback. Not how do we use these kind of things, functions within our own classes. It's funny because right now you are actually writing functions on a class called the main activity. So that's exactly the way that we use them. So if you wanted to actually make it for a custom U class, let me show you how I would do that. Let me go up here. I'm going to make my previous class of the user. And this class of the user this time is only based on a name, doesn't have anything more complex in it. And I have a name which is the name that we received. And then also I'm going to have a function. So U function I'm going to go ahead and say in the function the user can do, for instance, this is a friend or not. So basically this function, when we call it, it has to tell us whether this user is friend or not. Now, how do we do that? Calculation is kind of irrelevant right now. But what I want you to think about is what kind of return should this one give us? The function that is supposed to find out if someone is a friend or not, what kind of return it should give us? I feel like the return of it should be a boolean. So it has to be a boolean value that runs. Some calculations are done, some calculations are done. It has to return a value for us. It has to either return false because the user is not my friend, or it has to return true, because the user is my friend, or any of those things. So right now, if you make a user, we can actually give you the name and then we can check for that value, even though this is not really going to do anything right now because we obviously don't know how to do those calculations. It still can be used correctly. So I'm going to go to my uncreate somewhere up here and then go ahead and say I want to have a user. So let's go ahead and say value Steve, that's going to be a user by the name Steve, the user then, and then go ahead and say on this Steve, just check if is friend or not. And we know this value always returns false right now. That is true. And we know that we are doing it statically without actually having any dynamic way of testing for values. It's always false. Right now, however, I want to think about here again. We have the same situation as we had with that number 48, simply because right in the middle of our code, we are writing what's right in the middle of uncreate. The result of this value would be false because it's always a cross, and that's not a good thing. However, I could do another thing. I could say, let's put this in a statement. So I'm going to say if Steve is a friend, then do this and then else do something else. What would be that case, for instance? A very simple one that you definitely have seen on social media. If a Steve is a friend, shake the friend box, otherwise leave the brand box empty. So this way we will know that if the user that we are searching for is a friend of us, we can actually see that the friend box of them is checked. Otherwise the phone box would be empty. So you can actually click on it and, for instance, request friendship or anything of the source. So this was a quick introduction as to how we use functions with arguments, with the task, how we use functions within our own classes and how do we call them and how do we use the results of them. Sometimes the results of them, they just do something for us that they don't have a return. Sometimes the returns of them, we actually put it in another variable because we want to do something with it. So let's keep it up to here. I want you to do a little bit of an exercise on your own, and that is writing a function for your user class that basically compares to users and tells you if these two are the same user. So, for instance, on your social media application, you are navigating between user and user, user, user. And right now you have ended up at a certain place with certain users. It is likely it's not impossible that this user is you yourself, because you could have been navigating through so many pages and you eventually ended up at yourself again. So we want to check for that. You want to know whether this user is me? So trying to find the function that compares to users and tells you whether those two users are the same, and I give you a little bit of a hint. Obviously, you have to find something that is unique between users. Names are not unique. So keep that in mind. So try to write that down once you're good and ready, and hopefully you can successfully. Let's move on to our next. Here to talk about more serious programming, they're looking to functions in this lesson. We use functions to execute a particular task. Among many other reasons, functions also can have input values and they could also have returns. So let's see all of these in practice. I'm going to head into Android Studio. I'm going to open a new application. I'm going to call it functions. Now, let's see how it functions. Actually do things for me once my application goes up. I started writing the most simple of the functions, and this is going to be a function called let's call it simple function. And the simple function is like that. It doesn't really do anything. It doesn't take any arguments. It doesn't return anything. But it is a separate piece of code. Now, imagine you wanted to do this. Imagine you wanted to come to uncreate in your uncreate. You wanted to do something like a toast. So you basically wanted to say toast. And in the toast you want to say hi and then say this and then put it hi and then you wanted to show it. Now, if this is happening between the uncreate, what they could do is I could actually say let this happen within my simple function in here and run this simple function in my uncreate. So basically this way, I managed to organize my code. I said, well, whatever I want to happen, which is longer in here, in this case, 4 lines of code, is going to happen within this function, but you run that function within my uncreate. So that's like the most basics of having a function. However, there's other ways of doing this. There are functions that they can take in an argument or multiple arguments. Let's see how we can actually change this function to take that. Let me actually change these functions. Name I'm going to call it my function. So my function currently doesn't take in any arguments. Let's go ahead and say is going to take the value that we want to show in here. So this value API is a string. So if instead of that we have another thing, for instance, if I go ahead and say my string is going to be high and then I say toast is going to toast, this value obviously is going to still stay high. But the high is basically coming from this attribute of this variable, basically. So instead of that, I want to actually feed this from whoever is calling the function. So I'm going to say my function takes an argument. Let's say that argument is principal value, which is of the type a string. So whenever we call my function, we have to feed into value, add to it. So whoever is calling my function and it is showing me an error is saying that you haven't really given me what I need. It says no value passed for parameter value. So it's saying when you call this function, you have to feed a value of the type of string. I'm going to say that is going to be my name or that's going to be the name of a city, for instance. Or whatever. That is my intention, as long as I know that value is going to be extremely valuable. So I feed that value into it and whatever my function gets called, instead of always statically printing hi, I'm going to say you will do a toast or whatever you found in here, or let's call this one input value. I'm going to call this one in value. And I'm going to say every time my function is called whatever we give into it, this function is going to pass that one to whatever body of the function it has. This part, we call it the body of the function. This is obviously the declaration of the function. This is the arguments of the function and this is the body of the function. And this function doesn't have any return type just yet. So we will see how we can actually function with return types in a second. So far we managed to have functions that these functions, they basically take in an argument and they do something that in this case they just toast it. But obviously we could do a lot more complex matters with them as well. Now, let's go ahead and write another function. This function is basically going to take two values and it's going to multiply them together and it's going to show me the result of it. I kind of leave this to you guys if you want. Pause the video in here, try it on your own and then come back to see my solution. Or if you want, just tag along with me and see what I'm doing. So my function, let's call it multiplier function. It basically is going to take two values. So I have to have two of these. So I'm going to say 5, which is going to be an integer and m which is going to be an integer. So if you have multiple arguments, you basically separate them by a comma. Let me put this sort of get to the here. So if you have multiple arguments, you basically separate them by a comma. I am integer, an integer. What do we want to happen? We want to multiply them together. So if you want to multiply two values, for instance, I multiply by m, you actually have to put this value in something because there's no point of multiplying. For instance, the fact that you multiply 3 by 6 by 4, you would tell me 3 by 4 is 12. You would say okay, 3 by 4 because this is that meaning 3 by 4 without saying. So what happens is I'm going to go ahead and say its other value, let's call it the result, which is going to be I multiplied by so basically the result is the multiplication of these two values together. And for instance I want to actually show that. So I'm going to go ahead and say toast in the toast. I'm going to say in here, show us the value of results to a string and don't worry about that, we'll come back to this towards the end of this section. This is a way to convert an integer to a string and going they show the result of that. So now I'm sure you can guess what's going to happen here. If I go in here and in my uncreate and I say multiplier function is going to say, well, give me two numbers. I'm going to say 6 and 8. So it's going to take 6. I was going to get 8. It's going to multiply 6 by 8. And it's going to become 48. And then it's going to say toast. Show me 48 basically. And this will be a return function with multiple arguments. And in this case it basically multiplies them together. There could be many other things that you might need to do. Now let's do another one in this other one. We want to actually take a value and multiply it by another value and then we want to return that value. Keep in mind but what I mean by return right now, when we call the multiplier function, it basically does something. It shows it on the screen. But nothing from this function, from multiplying function, nothing basically comes back to my uncreate. What if I want to have a function that does a calculation and then the returns that value to me? So doing that is actually rather simple. I'm actually going to get rid of this whole tosspot. I'm going to say this function, multiply a function at the end. I'm going to add the column and I'm going to say this function returns an integer, adding a column and a value type. It simply tells the function that what are you returning? But come back in this system, we're going to talk about how we can detect that touch on a specific object. So let's head into the studio and here I'm going to start with an application called Touch an Object. And let's go ahead and get started with our code. Yes, I'm going to go to my activity. I'm going to actually make an object. When I want to basically detect the touches on it. Let's say we don't have this text view. Instead, I actually have a view. The simplest of the objects, a view is just a simple square that doesn't really do anything. It can be used as container for other objects, but it doesn't really do anything on its own. I'm going to go ahead and say the background for it. Let's say the background for it is this kind of orange, yellow, red kind of color is called red view. So called red view. And now I'm going to go ahead and say it is actually 500 deep, which is actually too much. They think that deep by 300 deep. So it's got the same with height and also it is centered horizontally and centered vertically.
So it's right in the middle of my screen and it is called a red view. And that's all I'm going to be doing in my interface builder. Now I'm going to head into my main activity. Now, writing the code to detecting it touched on an object is rather simple, but I want to show you a few different ways so we get a bit more confidence in terms of writing code enforcement. So let's put aside the first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to say, read you, and then I'm going to read you. Sits untouched listener. There are a few different types of methods that we can using here. For now, I'm going to use this one and I'm going to say we get the view, we get the motion event end. Then victim here, we have to actually do. Our very first thing I want to do is I want to say, let's get the view, whatever is the viewing. And then do a performance. So I'm going to say perform click and that basically to read a warning that you had over there. And now the rest of it is exactly like what we did in our previous listen. This is our motion event, or motion event has something called action NASP. The action must know whether the action is up or down or move or whatever, and then you do a stuff depending on that. So, for instance, I could go ahead and say when let's say motion is granted to that action mask. So I'm inlining everything up, putting everything together in one line instead of writing it separately. I'm going to say when motion of an action mask, let's go ahead and say, for instance, I could say motion events that action down. So in the mode of the action. Now do this and then I'm going to go ahead and say that it's another one motion event. The action up and the action up. I want to do this other thing. And just like the last time we think any of these, we actually have to return a value. So I'm going to go ahead and say in this one, it's true also in this one with and through. And then there is still one more condition that the wind is actually warning us about. There's a little red underlined squiggly line under it that says there's still one condition that you haven't taken care of, and that is the X. So I'm going to say, if none of these things was happening, let's go ahead and say it is also true. So you have to make sure you take care of all the different conditions. If it is a situation like this one that the teacher wants to know which one is happening. And now for us, the only thing I really wanted to try in here was this, so I could go ahead and say tossed, and then I'm going to say post in here and do whole staff read. The view was touched. And that's pretty much all I want to do in here. So, red, you said don't touch this and perform, and then find what kind of touch has been done and then decide what you want to do when that touch lands on it. I'm going to go ahead and write this application. Now, let me put up my Android emulator. And from now, if the application loads up, I should be able to touch on the red view, but not anywhere else. So here, when I touch, nothing happens to red. You and I touch it, says red. You was touched. And you can imagine that you can simply expand on this application and make it that for any object that you touch, you can find the name of that object and show it. Or you could change some sort of properties on a scale of them, the alpha of them, or whatever you want to be doing for that particular application. Now, I told you earlier on at the beginning that I want to show you a few different ways of writing this code, and let's have a look at how else we could write. And if you're wondering why I would want to suggest another way, is simply because if you keep writing the code like this between the body of on create, soon enough you can create would be rather busy. And that's basically what I'm trying to avoid. I'm trying to find a way that I don't write everything within the body of my uncreate. Unfortunately, this part of the recipe was set on touchless. Now it must happen within the uncreate. There are obviously other ways of mitigating the situation. For instance, you could come in here and say, I'm going to close my uncreate function here. I'm going to add a new function, I'm going to call it my touch function starts, and then this might touch function does a. All of these things I'm going to put them, I touch within my uncreate, just maybe I can modularize my code a little bit so things become a little bit cleaner. There is another way, which is this type, the return that we want for the untouched listener. I'm actually going to go ahead and put it between a new function. So let's see how I'm going to do that. I'm going to say this is another function. Let's say this function. Let's call it my touch return. Well, anything that you want to be calling it, the thing that really matters about this function is that it returns a view that on touch listener, and you probably have to import your view, which is by holding Alt Enter and saying import. And now I've got a function called myTouch then that returns a view on touchless center. And now I could go ahead and say for this one, we have to write the body of it. The one thing that is very important is that we have to return some value from it. So I'm going to say it and value myTouch value, let's call it that is going to be viewed that on touchless. And if I can type it correctly in touch listener and then the untouched listener in here is very similar to the one that we used over there. It could be exactly the same piece of code. In fact, I'm actually going to copy this entire code because it's going to be exactly like that. So I'm going to say my antiris is something like that. Again, it has a value. It has emotional event. Again, we do perform click again. We decide about all of these things. The one thing that's going to be different in this function is that once we calculated all of that here, at the end of this untouched listener, I'm going to say return on what do I want that I want to return. My touch value. You could, of course, to this whole thing in one go. You could actually say, instead of putting it between an argument, I could say just return a copy. This I could say just return this entire thing. And now that's another way of marginalizing your code and making sure that your code goes into a separate function. And this way you have a cleaner code when it comes to your mind control and create. Now, the way you could be using this one is very simple. I could go ahead and say that's that one out. Let's say read the view. And in the view, I'm going to say sits on touch listener and then the set on touchless and one of them. This one wants a return, which is of the type view and motion of it. And that's exactly what we have in here. We have a new listener. So I'm going to say set on I and myTouch returns so it automatically calculates everything that you want for that view and you add a listener for it. So a few different ways of doing it. Either you put this entire thing within the body of your uncreate or you put a new function with a return type that you need. And then obviously we can call that function within your untouched listener. As always, you could put these in separate files to make sure that your code doesn't become bloated very easily. The reason I keep suggesting about this modular raising and maintenance of these earlier stages is simply because soon enough you would have applications with hundreds of lines of code and you can't just be putting them all within one file. It would be very clear that it would be very difficult to read, not just for you, for anyone who wants to work with you is just basically a good practice of knowing how to keep your code very clean and very well organized to be very readable. So that's about that for touching a particular object. Let's give it up to here. Let's move on to our next lesson.
This is then we'll talk about object animators, which is a way of animating that depends on the object's kind of values. Let's see how we can do that. I'm going to show them to Andrew. The studio starts. A new application is called this one object animator. And in my object animator, I'm going to go ahead and wait for everything to load up in here. And what they want to do is I want to head into all my layouts today. I have at least one object. So in here, very similar to the last time, I'm actually not going to experiment a lot. I'm going to basically go ahead and make a box. So that's going to be my box. This is going to be a view is going to have the background and that background is going to be a red color. So I can see it clearly in here. And now I'm also going to add a button in here, something like a button over here. This button, I'm going to say, is horizontally centered and it is sticking to the top 20 on this button. The text, and it says animate. And it is actually saying animate button. And this one is as if for minority view. And that's all I want to be doing in here between my layout. So the rest of it has to be between my actual coat, my coat. I'm going to head into my uncreate in my uncreate. I'm going to actually add a click listener for my brother and then I say animate button sets on click listener. And in here we want to basically go ahead and make ourselves an object animator. And yet I'm going to show you first how we could make a single object animator. Then I'm going to show you how we could actually make more than one. Let's go ahead and say, in my object animator in here in my button brain is clicked. What I want to do is I want to say value. Let's say I want to move it on the translation of Y. So I'm going to say translation of y, it becomes a object animator's object animator of float. So because we know the type of the animation we want to cause is float. If we knew if it is off type or without of RGB, so on and so forth. Now for the float, this thing, the very first thing you have to fit into me is the target. So the target is the red U, then we're going to have to feed into it the property name. So I'm going to say you got translation of y, that is what I want to change. Then I'm going to go ahead and say, what is the current value of the property that you want to feed? I'm going to say red val, not translation want, whatever is its current value. Then I'm going to go ahead and say make it right to you. That translation of y plus, let's say 100. So what it does is basically says I want to move things on the y, find the current y, add another 100 to it and make it to that, just like the last time. We have to decide what the duration is. I'm going to say translation of y, the duration, let's say this time 500 milliseconds. Another thing we could do is actually decide about this type of the interpreter, which is basically the way the animation runs. Whether you want your animation runs in a linear mode, which is basically a linear interpreter, which means it goes from the value of this one to this value in a linear mode. In every millisecond it adds a certain amount to it. You could make it like bounce interpreter, which basically makes it to go slowly at the beginning and faster at the end. There are several different types of interpreter. I suggest that you have a look through the documentation, so get yourself a little bit more familiar. I will show you a few of those myself soon as well. Now we got the basics of an object animator already, and this could very well work. Let's go ahead and see what we have in here. If we run our application and we head into our Android emulator, we should be able to tap on this button every time and move our object. Yes, it moves and moves in a linear way. And that's great. Now, I want to actually go in here and make a few changes, not because of any particular reason. I just want to show you how we would do it, even though I'm pretty sure you guys would already be able to manage it. I want to basically put all of this stuff into a function so I can call this function from time to time for whatever I want to be doing. Let's see how we're going to do that. I'm going to go in here and say, actually outside my uncreate, I want to have a new function. Let's call this one function. I'm going to call it animate, not dysfunctional. Animate is supposed to do all of these things except that. I want to be able to fit different objects to it, so I know which object actually gets animated. I want to fit different types of interpreter to it so I know which objects, what type of interpreter happens. I want to fit different durations to it and I want to type with different animation types. So let's see how we're going to do all of these. What I'm going to do is actually I'm going to copy this. I'm going to say let's copy that, paste it entirely in here. Now, the very first thing is I don't want this to always be on the view, so I'm going to cut that out. Instead of that, I'm going to say target is an argument in here of the type view. So you get that right on the target. So that's the first. And then the second thing I want to be doing is I want to actually say what kind of property I want to feed into. The property basically has two values. One of them is the type of the object and then the other one is the type of the property. So I'm going to go in here and say, let's call this one. Let's call it property, and then my property is going to be up the type property of types view and let's say float for now. We could make it even more extensive that it would accept other types. But let's keep it this way one step at a time. So instead of doing the animation on the view, the translation of y I actually want to write on the property. So whatever we feed in there, that animation we draw, then we have two other values. We have a value from and then we have a value of the two. So those are going to be very easy. I'm going to say from that's going to be a float and then I'm going to have a tool which is also going to be a float. So this becomes from and this obviously becomes 2. So that's also taken care then. Or animation has a duration. So that makes sense to be customizable. So duration, which is also an integer, if I'm not wrong this time, or rather as long. So I'm going to say the duration becomes the value for here. And then we have perhaps the more complex one, which is the interpreter. So I'm going to say I have a value, let's call it interpolate, which is off the time after type time. Interpreter, and obviously that becomes my interpreter. So basically everything that was done within this animation statically, we are basically putting them into arguments of the function. So if we call that function is going to add that for us. Now, let's see what's the point of doing this. I'm going to go up here, and instead of doing this whole block of code, I'm actually going to comment that I'm going to say instead of that, when I click on my button, do this, say animate. And the animated says when you have to feed all of these arguments. So the value of it is right. The view, then the property for it would be, I think we would translate y if I'm not wrong. So it would be a view. The translation, y. So I want to animate the translation y, if it then is going to say what's the value that you want to feed into it. I'm going to say, let's say you got the translation line and then the other value, which is the true value of it, is the same plus 100. We're just trying to mimic what we had in here. Exactly. So that has to have an f at the end of it. Then I'm going to go ahead and say that the operation is 500, and this is what is the interpreter. I'm going to say this time is decelerate interpreter. So I'm feeding all the values to the animator and is going to go ahead and animate the y-axis or animate on the y-axis. Now, if you run this application now, we should see exactly the same thing as we saw before, minus the fact that the interpreter is different. Last time was linear. The spine is decelerate. Let's see that. Yes. So that's working. Now, whether I could actually go ahead in here and I could apply the same set of formulas to get an animation on the output, for instance. So I could go ahead and say, let's copy this, paste it in here. So whenever we click, we get the animation on the y-axis, but we also want to get animated the alpha. And I'm going to say the object is the right view, but the value they want to animate is alpha. So the transparency, the value of it is going to be, let's say from 1. This is 1. Let's go to 1f first. Let's go to 0f, let's keep it at 500 milliseconds. So they go along with each other, and then I'm going to go ahead and say the linear interpreter would do better in here. So linear interpreters, so what's happening this time is if we run this application now, both of these animations will run almost parallel to each other. The top that, and as it's going down, it also gets to be completely invisible. And that's the purpose of having this function here. Again, something that you might need. I've definitely had situations when I needed this. That's why I wanted to show it to you guys. There are other ways of running animation as parallel to each other. There's an animation set that you will see really soon, but this is also a good handy way of running different kinds of animations. And you can also change the durations between them. For instance, you could say that it gets to be transparent longer, let's say, in 2.5 seconds, than the object movement, so you can play around with this, try different ways for it. And this was like a very basic introduction to how big an object animator. Let's keep it up to here, and let's move on to our next lesson.
Welcome back. In this system, we'll talk about adding maps to applications. The map is the mere graphical representation of the locations. The actual location, in fact, is a separate entity from maps. So this we'll begin with showing a map in an application. Now, to get to that, we also need to get some extra settings from the Google APIs. I'm going to show you all of that in this system. So let's get started. I'm going to head into Android Studio and I'm going to start a new application, and the activity, as usual, I'm going to call it Maps app, and I'm going to hit the finish by then,
Now, the moment it loads up, I want to show you a little bit of a trick in making your maps activity. Because you could actually start writing the code on your own. But then we would have to change a few things in under this, would you? And basically the greater part instead of that, I'm actually going to go ahead and use the Google Maps activity, and that's going to make a lot of the code for me. And I will explain to you what those codes are. Why do I basically need them to come in here? And I'm going to say a new name, I'm going to search for the Google and Google. I'm going to go for Google Maps activity. And it's going to basically make a new activity for us, which is the Maps activity. It doesn't matter what you name it, because we're not going to really use this. We're just going to copy stuff from it. So then I had to finish for them and I will explain to you what it did for us. The first thing is it added these Google Maps API, XM, which is basically telling us what is the SSA. Cert for this application that we need in the Google Maps console is also giving us a place to copy the API key. That's another thing that we need. However, there's other things that this thing has done for us, added the Maps activity as well as the Maps layout. It also added a new dependency for us. That dependency is basically place services, maps. So these are basically the steps that we had to do in the Google Maps, or rather the Maps activity and the activity Maps layout. There are also some code that it has done for us, and that's what I'm going to be copying from these two, and I'm going to show, how we're going to use it. So for now, I don't need to worry about anything integrated or anything in the values. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the activity maps. I'm actually going to go to the code part of it. I'm going to copy this fragment, all of it by its entirety, and then watch my activity main, and I'm going to paste it in here. So what I need from this fragment is basically a few things. I need the fragment of the type support map fragment manager. I want to give it an idea. I want to have a bit and hide, and that's about it. So I don't need any of those. This is a good place for you guys to exercise your understanding of how using quotes and making layouts, they work. So now we made a fragment of this type, which this type is now available to us because the greater for it is also available. And that basically makes a fragment that covers the entirety of the screen. So that's the first thing that we want to be doing. And of course, because I've done that, I don't need the activity maps anymore. I can just get rid of that in any way. Perfect. Now I'm going to go to the Maps activity and see what we can copy from here. I need basically two things. One is I need to get this spot, which is basically making my fragment. This is really nothing new. This is something we have done with the fragments in the past, which basically says map fragments. Support from Fridman Manager, and then find this guy that is called map, and then in the map fragment. Once it is ready, gets not been single. Now, what does this async actually do for us? It basically says whenever the map is ready, think that's not defragment, but how would the application know when the map is ready to do that? We actually have to extend our main activity to a class called onMapReadyCallback. And that's something that you can find in your Maps activity as what it's done up here as well. And then when you do that, basically this thing happens on the map. Ready? I'm actually going to go in here and say, well, let's implement all our thoughts. I'm going to have all and enter. And it says you have to implement the member on the map ready. And what you want me to do on the when the map is ready, I'm going to say, let's call this one map. And I'm going to go ahead and say I'm going to have my own map in here. Let's call it RA, my map of the type of Google Map. And of course, because I can't initialize it right now, I'm going to say this is I late in it end. Then I'm going to say when the map is ready, my map becomes this Google Map. So let's see what's happening in here, and let me see why is giving me the warning. That's all right. Let me delete that activity. This part is a little bit tricky because there's a lot of code that you have to write down, a few things that you have to be mindful. So I'm going to quickly re-explain this entire thing so we understand what's happening. So in theory, if you didn't want to do the way I did it, what you had to do is you have to put your build greater. You had to add this one Google Play Services, Maps, you had to sync your greater. And once you're done with that, your activity, you had to add the new fragment. That fragment type name should have been support fragments of that fragment manager. And then in your main activity, you actually have to go ahead and say extending the main activity to unmap pretty callbacks or whenever the map is ready and Google has done or under the application has done its communication with Google and Google has granted us the permission to use the map, then I'm going to set my map to be the map that is currently ready and I can use it for whatever I want to use it for. And we apply the map within a fragment to our application. So we apply the map on top of our review. So that's the starting point for this now. There's more steps and those smaller steps have to do with this guy. The file that has been added in here. This one isn't really doing anything. This is just a text file that allows us to copy some code from here that we need for our Google Developer Console and then applies the API key under the API. He always has to actually go to basically your manifest, and that's what it has done. It has said that metadata goes to metadata, looks at the finer points. The ones that are in this thing, Google Maps API, you could either keep the combination of these two files or you could just put the API key right in here and delete that file by its entirety before we do any of these things. Let me show you what we have to do in the Google Developer Console, how we should get our API and then we worry about how we going to use it in here. So this go into Chrome and encroach on their search for the Developer Console. If this is the first time we are coming to this console, is probably going to ask you for some permissions. That you want to make a project right off the bat or not. I have done this. I think this isn't really my main account. I've done some testing here, so there might be some stuff. In any case, I'm going to show you what you have to do from the very beginning. Let's say here at the very top, you want to go ahead and you want to make yourself a new project. I'm going to say there is a new project. This new project is going to be Android app. Try on maps and then I'm going to create, and once it is created, what they want to be doing is I want to basically get myself new credentials. And for those credentials, I have to enable different APIs. So basically you have a project in the project, you have credentials and each credential can use some of the many services that Google Support provides, basically. So here, I'm going to go ahead and say in the credentials and I'm still in the wrong project, just keep that in mind if you have many projects. So I have to switch to this new project that we created. I'm going to say in that one, let's create credentials. I'm going to say I want to make an API key and this is going to be our API. You can just copy that value. Then if you just make an API key, that's not really the best idea. You want to basically restrict it, so nobody else can access it. So to do that, I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to say in my API, let's go ahead and edit. That in the edit, you can actually restrict. So here I'm going to go ahead and say application restriction is Android applications and then it says which applications do you want to use. And here it says you have to enter the package name and this one signing certificate, something I say as an item. Here's the package. The very first thing, the package name is from your Android manifest right at the very top. This is the package name, or you could just get it from any of your main application files, so that all the institute that maps app, that's my package, and then says, give me the Sichuan certificate for the certificate, which is the one that the Google file automatically created for us. However, I want to show you another way of building that in case you needed it. So what you could do is you could actually go to the top right corner of your arm doing this. Would you go to the Cradle Integrator? You open your Maps application and the tasks. The task, the Open Android in the Android, the Open Signing Report, and you double click on that. I will build everything for you, including everything that you need, which in this case is the one. And that's the key that we need, which is the same key as the keys that's up here, is basically some sort of a certificate that you can use to sign a stuff. And then I say, this is the associate certificate and I'm going to have that done, which means now our application is now stored within this API credential, and this API credential can only work for this particular app. And this way, you make sure that nobody can steal your API key or nobody can use it for things that they shouldn't be using. Once that is done, there is one final step that we have to do in our developer console, and that is to enable the right API for the new credential that we created. Basically, the way it works is that you have a credential, and for that credential you say which of the many services of the Google do you want to use? Because obviously they are not all by default enabled. So I'm going to head into the APIs, and in the APIs I will see a list of the APIs, or if you have multiple projects, you can just switch between them. And it shows you the list of the APIs and here what they want to use. I want to basically use the Map SDK for Android, and I'm going to go ahead and say enable that for this project. Basically, if it wasn't enabled for your case, I think for me and beyond trying to project so difficult with this project, we can actually enable it to enable that. And now that it's enabled, it means that my applications, the ones that have been included in this API restrictions, they can actually use the Map SDK for Android. Now, I'm going to copy the API. I'm going to head back to Android Studio, and we are absolutely ready to go back to what we want to be doing. Keep in mind that if you were doing the thing that was just showing you signing report, then you have to change back the application up here, and you have to rerun on the application itself. So now in here, what you're going to be doing is I'm going to actually go into my Android Studio manifest. In the manifest, I'm actually going to skip this whole thing about using the Google Map API. I'm going to replace this key in here myself. So this is my appetite. And then there's a few final things we have to do is go ahead and say we had an activity called Maps. Activity that we deleted. So let's just get rid of that one. There are a lot of random code. And yes, I'm just going to delete those, so I don't need any of those. And I'm going to get rid of this part as well, because for now, we don't need it. I will explain to you in the coming lessons of why we need them. So the only thing that should change in your default manifest is basically having this piece metadata added somewhere within your application. If you want, you can actually take that up with at the very bottom of your application. So this is how your application looks like. And then at the very bottom of it, there is the Google Android, the GOP key, and then you put your API key in there. So that's one thing. And then I can actually delete this one because I don't need that one either. And now almost everything is ready for us to run our application. There is one final step that is probably not necessary for most people who are watching this, but that is you have to make sure that the emulator you're using actually does use Google Play services. So if that is not the case, then you have to make yourself an emulator. And sometimes the emulator might actually ask you to update your emulator with the latest Playzier. Because if it does that, then you must update it. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So I'm going to have the run, but I'm going to go to Android emulator. I'm going to wait to see what happens in here. And once my application loads up, we should be able to see this, which is basically the maps representation. So here we have the maps. We can actually, scale it using the command button or the console button. If you're using a Windows machine, we can rotate it. And that's basically the very first step of creating applications that they use the maps. So let's keep it up to here in the next list. We're going to make a copy of this project, and we're going to add more code on top of. We'll come again in the system. We learn how to transition from our app to the camera application, take your photo and then bring that photo back to our application. So let's get this started. I'm going out into Under the Studio, and here I'm going to start a new application. I'm going to call this one My Camera. And then the moment loads up in my Under the Studio. What they want to do is I actually want to head into my layout, and I want to make myself an image of you as well as a button. That's basically the plan that takes us to camera application. And then we have an image of you to show the photo that we took. So here I'm going to head into the design mode, because for now, I don't need to do something very basically elaborate at one more time because my grade isn't nearly finished yet. So here, I'm going to go ahead and say I have this button. This button is a little bit larger maybe. And then there's my image. Maybe they need something by default. I'm just going to give it this little image. It doesn't really matter for this test. And right now, I'm not going to really worry about the constraints. So because of that, I'm just going to go ahead and make this insert constraints. I'm just going to let it create its own constraints usually. Why does it resize sizes, but also the size of them necessary? Like so I'm just going to come back and make the height of the button, maybe 40, and now everything is good. Now here's my image, you and then this one, I'm going to call it a photo button. And now we are going to head into our programming and get started writing the actual code for how are we going to go to the camera application and how are you going to take photos back to here. So here's the very first thing I need to do is actually need to head into my manifest. I need to give it the right permission. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to go ahead and say user's permission and the permission that we want to be using is camera. And that's all I have to do in here for now. So we want to be able to access camera from our application. Now, I'm going to head into the main activity and in here I'm going to go ahead and say right at the very beginning and then create we should take care of our permission. However, keep in mind that you have to the permissions, the way that we saw in our previous lesson. Which is properly get the permissions depending on the result, making a request and depending on the results, setting a variable, pretty invaluable for now, because I want to cut down on the amount of code and I want to simplify. I'm just going to request for the permissions. So I'm just going to say the compound that request permissions. And this wants 3 arguments. The very first one is this and there is an array of permissions. So it's an array of the only permission I care about right now is manifest permission, that camera. And then finally, I'm going to give it a request code and I'm just going to start to give it 100. Keep in mind that this assumption right now is that when you're on this application, you will always offer the permission. You will always granted the permission. That's why I'm not checking whether there was or there wasn't. I'm not checking whether the permission has been granted or denied. And this isn't really a recommended way. But you can just get away with it for now because we want to make our code a little bit less overwhelming. So here, once we have that permission, we actually have to go to our take photo. By then, I'm going to say sit on click listener for this and then click listener for it. We to do basically something very simple, which is we actually have to go ahead and say there is an intent that takes us to action image capture. So I'm going to say real intent, which is not an internal error. It's an intent in terms of media story that's on the media. So I'm going to get action image capture. So that's my intent and what we want to be doing. You actually want to start with it. Now, here's the thing. You can't really just start the activity, for instance, such as this one, simply because you want to know what happens with them, what they mean with them. Is that what happens when you go to this activity and you do whatever you want to be doing in there? What is the result of that and what would you like to do with that result? Because of that, you have to start the activity for results. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and say start activity for result and this selectivity for results. You basically have 2 things: the activity, the intents that you want to go to, and then as well as the request code for it. And I would expect you would do both of these things. So I'm going to say this activity will result intent and then I'm going to say the request code for it is actually going to be. I'm going to give it a name, so here I'm going to say where camera results, quote, I'm going to put this add, let's say 1 or 1. Now I'm going to say this is my request. And the reason we do this is because we want to know when we get the activity results, which could be interesting because there might be different activity results. And this is the one that we're interested in when we open the camera. So how am I going to use that? I'm going to come in here. I'm going to say in my after my uncreate, I'm going to say an activity result. So this is an override function, basically very similar to uncreate. So here it has the request. It has the result code and it has the database. So when go ahead in here, I'm going to say if request code in here, if this lanio is camera result code. So basically if the results I've gotten is for this opening of the camera. So that's great. Now we have to check to see if there actually is a result code. So I'm going to go ahead and say you've resolved code is activity in that result, okay? So if that was the case as well, of course you can put these two if statements are using an AND logical operation in here. I'm just going to leave it like this for now before I write the code to handle the images that we take by the camera. Let me actually run the application so we see what we have so far. So I'm going to come up here from the application and heading to my Android emulator in here. When I go in there, obviously at the very beginning, it asked me whether I want to give access to the cameras. I'm going to say hello. And then when I hit the button, it actually takes me to this place, which is basically the camera application of the device. In this camera application, there is a little bit of an emulator in here that we can actually use the old for them to navigate around the room. You can also use the combination of WAAX, the like, basically any video game, which, as you know, we're on, and then you can take a photo. So here I'm going to say take this photo. And then once this photo is taken, the moment I had this taken by the notice, okay, by then, this is where the activity results gets called and the results are coming to this application, which is basically these results are in data and now they are actually get this data and show it on our image view. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and say, oh, I have a discarded image bitmap and that's going to be the item that is an optional value. We don't know if the intent actually has anything in here. So I'm going to get the non-optional part of it. I'm going to say extras from the extras. I'm going to get the on the outer part of it. So that's going to be tough and I'm going to get it as bitmap. And now we've gotten ourselves a bitmap image from the image that we have taken from our with our camera. And obviously, I could go ahead and say image of view, not that image view dart set image bitmap. And then obviously that becomes image bitmap. Now, before I run this code, I want to show you a little thing just to know as a precautionary matter before you begin your activity for results. Usually you want to check to make sure that your intent can resolve this activity. So maybe go ahead and say if intent the result of activity for this package manager, if this wasn't a knowledge, which basically means if we could come in here and get some warnings or errors in here. For whatever reason, let me see. What is that? So I don't need that. So that's right. If that was the case, then go to the activity and just simply making sure that the intent, this intent, basically can go to a place such as image capture. This is just a precautionary thing to make sure that your package manager allows the same time to open they, for instance, in this case to camera. And that's all we have to do in here. Let me refactor the code a little bit so things are a little bit easier to see whenever I'm coding. I like the text to be a stock like this, but I'm teaching. I prefer to see more code in one screen. So that's the situation that we have because the intent we wait for the activity. For example, once we come back, we get the image bitmap and we show it on our image. Will let me run the application and we can see what we got so far. She is going to put up once again, and once it shows up at the bar, then obviously is not going to ask me for the permission anymore because we already have granted the permission, I'm going to say. But in here, I'm going to go ahead and say, let's take a photo of this corner. And once the photo was taken, I'm going to have the OK button. And when we come back, we see that image. Not if you notice the image here is actually not a very high quality image. She's actually got a very blurry look. And that's simply because data is actually giving us the thumbnail of the image is not bringing the full resolution image, the full resolution image. You should save it on your SD card and then access it. And that's something I'm going to show you in our next little